February 19, 1943, over Bougainville, Solomon Islands. Flight Petty Officer Kaneyoshi Muto's hands tightened on the control stick of his Mitsubishi A6M0 as his formation spotted the American fighters climbing toward them. For 18 months, the Zero had ruled Pacific skies through superior maneuverability and range. But something was different about these American aircraft approaching from below. Their distinctive inverted gull wings and massive radial engines identified them as Vought F4U Corsairs, a type Muto had heard rumors about but never encountered. Within minutes, he would experience what Japanese naval aviators would come to call the speed barrier, the moment when Japan's primary fighter revealed a limitation so fundamental that no amount of pilot skill could overcome it. The engagement began conventionally. Muto's section leader signaled the attack, and 4 Zeros rolled into diving turns toward the climbing Corsairs. In every previous engagement, this maneuver had worked. American fighters would try to turn with the Zeros and die in the twisting dogfight that followed, or they would flee, extending away while Zero pilots claimed the sky. But these Corsairs did neither. As the Zeros completed their diving attack and pulled up to re-engage, the American fighters simply accelerated. Not in panic, not in desperation, but with a methodical inevitability that Muto found deeply unsettling. He pushed his throttle to its maximum position, feeling the Nakajima Sakai engine respond with its familiar surge. His airspeed indicator climbed toward 330 miles per hour, the Zero's maximum velocity in level flight. The Corsairs ahead continued accelerating, pulling away as if his Zero were standing still. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Muto attempted pursuit for another 30 seconds, before the Corsairs disappeared into the distance, leaving him with the bitter realization that he had just encountered an aircraft that could simply refuse combat on Japanese terms. The Zero's legendary maneuverability meant nothing if the enemy never allowed the battle to become a turning fight. Speed, the one performance parameter Japanese designers had sacrificed to achieve range and agility, had just revealed itself as the decisive factor in modern air combat. This single engagement, repeated hundreds of times across the Solomon Islands in early 1943, marked the beginning of Japan's loss of air superiority, not through better American tactics, though those would come, but through the brutal physics of powerplant performance and aerodynamic design. To understand how Japanese pilots found themselves helplessly watching American fighters accelerate beyond reach, one must examine the divergent design philosophies that shaped the Zero and the Corsair. Both aircraft emerged from naval requirements, both were intended as carrier-based fighters, yet they embodied fundamentally different assumptions about what would determine victory in the Pacific Air War. The Mitsubishi A6M0 had been designed in 1937 to meet Imperial Japanese Navy specifications that prioritized range above all else. Japan's strategic planning assumed operations across vast Pacific distances, where conventional fighters lacked the endurance to escort bombers or patrol effectively. Chief designer Jiro Horikoshi received requirements calling for a fighter with range sufficient to escort attack aircraft over China's enormous interior, where Japanese forces were engaged in a grinding war of attrition. To achieve this extraordinary range with available engine technology, Horikoshi and his team made systematic weight reductions throughout the aircraft's design. They eliminated pilot armor and self-sealing fuel tanks. They used lightweight aluminum alloys developed specifically for aviation. They minimized structural weight through ingenious engineering, creating an airframe that weighed remarkably little for its size. The power plant selected for the Zero reflected these priorities. The Nakajima Sakai 14-cylinder radial engine produced 950 horsepower, adequate for an aircraft designed to weigh barely 5,500 pounds fully loaded. This power-to-weight ratio enabled the Zero's famous climb rate and maneuverability, but it imposed absolute limits on maximum speed that no amount of aerodynamic refinement could overcome. Japanese engineers understood physics. They knew that drag increased with the square of velocity, meaning that achieving higher speeds required exponentially more power. With the Sake engine's output fixed at less than 1,000 horsepower, the Zero's maximum speed was determined by the point where engine thrust exactly balanced aerodynamic drag. That equilibrium occurred at approximately 330 miles per hour in level flight. Increasing speed beyond this point would require either more powerful engines, which Japan's aviation industry struggled to develop, or acceptance of reduced range and maneuverability, which contradicted the Zero's entire design purpose. The Vought F4U Corsair emerged from a completely different set of assumptions. When the United States Navy issued its specification for a new carrier fighter in 1938, the primary requirement was speed. Naval planners, studying the European Air War and Japanese operations in China, concluded that future air combat would increasingly favor aircraft that could control the terms of engagement through superior speed and climb rate. Maneuverability remained important, but not at the expense of performance. Range was necessary, but not if it required sacrificing the ability to catch or escape from enemy fighters. Vaught's design team, led by Chief Engineer Rex Beisel, proposed the most powerful fighter engine then available for installation in a naval aircraft. The Pratt & Whitney R2 800 double Wasp 18-cylinder radial engine produced 2,000 horsepower, more than double the Zero's output. This enormous power came with significant weight. The engine alone weighed over 2,000 pounds. The propeller required to absorb this power measured 13 feet in diameter, presenting serious challenges for carrier operations where ground clearance was limited. Beisel's solution was the Corsair's distinctive inverted gull wing, which allowed the massive propeller adequate clearance while keeping the landing gear relatively short and strong. The Corsair that emerged from this design process weighed 12,400 pounds fully loaded, more than twice the Zero's weight, but it had more than twice the power, and critically, that power enabled performance in regimes where the Zero simply could not compete. Maximum speed reached 415 miles per hour at altitude, nearly 100 miles per hour faster than the Zero. Rate of climb exceeded 4,000 feet per minute, substantially better than the Zero, despite the Corsair's greater weight. Diving speed was limited primarily by structural considerations rather than power plant performance, meaning the Corsair could accelerate in a dive to velocities where the Zero's lighter structure risked catastrophic failure. These performance differences translated directly into tactical advantages that Japanese pilots found impossible to counter. An American pilot in a Corsair could initiate combat when conditions favored him and disengage whenever the situation became unfavorable. He could maintain altitude advantage, diving on Japanese formations with impunity, knowing that if the attack failed, he could simply extend away using superior speed. Japanese pilots, regardless of skill or experience, could not force combat on their terms. They could not pursue fleeing Corsairs. They could not escape attacking Corsairs. They were trapped in an aircraft whose limitations had been carefully designed into it by engineers who never anticipated facing opponents with such overwhelming power advantages. The first Corsair squadron to deploy to the South Pacific was MPH, a Marine Corps unit that arrived at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal on February 12, 1943. The squadron was commanded by Major William Gies, a veteran pilot who had flown Wildcats earlier in the campaign. His pilots had received extensive training in the Corsair's capabilities and had developed tactics specifically designed to exploit the aircraft's speed advantage against Japanese fighters. Those tactics, refined through combat experience over the following months, would fundamentally alter the nature of air combat in the Pacific. The doctrine was conceptually simple, but required discipline to execute. Never dogfight. Never attempt to turn with a Zero. Instead, maintain speed above 300 miles per hour at all times. Use altitude advantage to dive on Japanese formations. Make a single high-speed firing pass. If the attack succeeds, the enemy aircraft is destroyed. If it fails, continue diving and use superior speed to extend beyond Japanese pursuit range. Then climb back to altitude using the Corsair's superior rate of climb and repeat the attack. Japanese pilots called this tactic hit and run, American pilots called it boom and zoom. Whatever the terminology, it proved devastatingly effective against aircraft that could not match the Corsair's speed. Japanese fighter pilots initially attempted to counter these tactics using the Zero's superior maneuverability. When Corsairs dove through their formations, Zero pilots would break hard into the attack, attempting to bring their guns to bear during the brief moment when the American fighters passed through. Occasionally, this succeeded. A Zero pilot with exceptional timing and situational awareness might get a burst of fire into a Corsair during its attack run. But more commonly, the Corsairs flashed past too quickly for effective engagement. By the time a Zero pilot recognized the threat, oriented his aircraft, and prepared to fire, the Corsairs were already beyond effective gun range and accelerating away. Some Japanese pilots attempted to chase the retreating Corsairs, hoping to close range during the American fighters' zoom climb back to altitude. This proved suicidal. The Corsair's 2,000 horsepower engine could sustain a rate of climb that the Zero could match only briefly before its lighter engine lost the energy battle. American pilots climbing away from attacks could monitor Japanese pursuit with confidence, knowing that no Zero could maintain closure. If a particularly aggressive Japanese pilot tried to follow the zoom climb, he would find himself slow, at low altitude, in perfect position for the next Corsair attack. Flight Petty Officer Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's most experienced naval aviators with over 60 confirmed victories, encountered Corsairs for the first time in April 1943. Sakai had survived the entire first year of the Pacific War, fighting over the Philippines, Java, New Guinea, and the Solomon Islands. He had developed tactics for defeating wildcats, had learned to exploit the P-40 Warhawk's weaknesses, and had trained countless replacement pilots in air combat techniques. But the Corsair presented challenges he found impossible to overcome. In his post-war memoir, Samurai, Sakai described his frustration at engaging an enemy that refused traditional combat. He wrote that American pilots in Corsairs would not fight in the classic manner. They attacked from above with tremendous speed, fired briefly, then continued diving away before any Zero pilot could respond. Attempts to pursue were futile. The Corsairs simply accelerated beyond reach, climbing back to altitude to repeat the process. Sakai noted that no amount of pilot skill or combat experience could compensate for an 85-mile-per-hour speed disadvantage. The aircraft's performance determined the battle's outcome before a shot was fired. Japanese naval air staff recognized the problem quickly. Combat reports from frontline units throughout the Solomon Islands repeatedly described the same tactical situation. Zeros could not catch Corsairs in level flight. They could not pursue them in climbs. They could not escape them in dives. Every engagement occurred on American terms, and Japanese pilots were dying in aircraft that had become obsolete, not through age, but through technological inadequacy. But understanding the problem and solving it were entirely different challenges. Japan's aviation industry in 1943 faced constraints that made developing a Corsair-equivalent fighter virtually impossible. The primary limitation was powerplant technology. Japanese aircraft engine manufacturers, primarily Nakajima and Mitsubishi, had developed excellent engines for their power output ranges. The Sakaya engine in the Zero was reliable, fuel-efficient, and produced its rated power consistently, but scaling up to 2,000 horsepower class engines required advances in metallurgy, manufacturing precision, and design sophistication that Japanese industry had not achieved. The 18-cylinder radial engines necessary for Corsair-level performance required specialized high-temperature alloys for cylinders and valves. They needed precision-manufactured crankshafts capable of handling enormous rotational forces. They demanded fuel injection systems that could deliver precise fuel quantities at high manifold pressures. Most critically, they required turbochargers or advanced mechanical superchargers to maintain power output at high altitudes. Japan had attempted to develop such engines. The Nakajima Homare 18-cylinder radial, intended to produce 1,800 horsepower, entered development in 1941. But manufacturing problems plagued the design throughout its service life. Cylinder tolerances proved difficult to maintain in production. The engine overheated chronically. Reliability remained poor, even after extensive redesign efforts. Aircraft, equipped with Homar engines, suffered disturbingly high rates of powerplant failure. The Mitsubishi Keisei 14-cylinder radial, designed for bomber applications, produced up to 1,560 horsepower, but was too large and heavy for fighter installation. Attempts to develop a more compact version failed to achieve production status before the war ended. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Beyond engine development, the Corsair's speed advantage revealed deeper industrial limitations. American factories could produce the specializing materials required for high-performance engines in sufficient quantities to support both development and production. Japanese factories struggled to manufacture advanced alloys consistently. Quality control problems meant that even successful engine designs suffered reliability issues in service due to material defects. The same industrial constraints that prevented Japan from matching American aircraft production also prevented matching American engine technology. Without powerful engines, high-speed fighters remained impossible, regardless of how skilled Japanese designers might be. Japanese aircraft designers attempted alternative solutions. If powerful engines were unavailable, perhaps extreme aerodynamic refinement could partially close the speed gap. The Kawanishi N-1K Shiden fighter, entering service in late 1943, used the problematic Homar engine, but incorporated extensive streamlining to reduce drag. The result was an aircraft slightly faster than the Zero, reaching approximately 370 miles per hour maximum speed. This was impressive for a 1900 horsepower fighter, but still 45 miles per hour slower than the Corsair. In combat, that difference remained decisive. The Kawanishi J-2M Raiden Interceptor, designed specifically for speed and climb rate, sacrificed range and maneuverability to achieve approximately 385 miles per hour. Closer to the Corsair's performance, but heavier, less agile, and available only in small numbers due to manufacturing problems with its Kasei engine. The Mitsubishi A7M, intended as the Zero's successor, promised improved speed through a more powerful engine and refined aerodynamics. But development dragged on for years. Engine problems delayed testing. Manufacturing issues prevented production scaling. By the time the A7M was ready for service in late 1944, American fighters had progressed even further. The war ended before the A7M could influence combat operations. Each Japanese attempt to develop a high-speed fighter revealed the same fundamental problem. Without industrial capacity to produce powerful, reliable engines in sufficient quantities, speed performance remained constrained. Japanese pilots continued flying aircraft that were tactically obsolete, fighting an enemy that could dictate every engagement. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots was profound and demoralizing. Fighter pilots are trained to believe in their ability to influence combat outcomes through skill and aggression. The Zero's early dominance had reinforced this belief. Japanese pilots had outfought Allied pilots in inferior aircraft through superior training and tactics. But against the Corsair, no amount of skill mattered. A Japanese pilot could be the most experienced aviator in his squadron, with perfect gunnery and flawless situational awareness. Yet he would be helpless against an American pilot of moderate skill flying a Corsair who simply refused close combat. This helplessness eroded morale systematically. Pilots who survived multiple encounters with Corsairs returned to base with stories of frustration and impotence. They described lining up perfect deflection shots, only to have the target accelerate away before they could fire. They told of watching Corsairs dive through their formations repeatedly, attacking with near impunity, knowing that pursuit was pointless. Replacement pilots arriving at frontline units heard these accounts and understood they were flying aircraft that had become death traps. The swagger and confidence that had characterized Japanese naval aviation in 1942 had evaporated by mid-1943, replaced by grim awareness that technological inadequacy was killing experienced pilots who should have survived. The strategic implications extended far beyond individual dogfights. Control of the air determines the outcome of naval and ground campaigns. An air force that cannot prevent enemy aircraft from operating over friendly forces will watch those forces suffer devastating losses. Japanese naval task forces attempting to reinforce garrisons in the Solomon Islands found themselves under constant air attack from Corsairs and other American fighters that Japanese Zeros could not effectively counter. Troop transports were sunk, supply convoys were decimated, ground forces defending islands were isolated and starved of reinforcements. Each failure to control the airspace over contested areas led directly to tactical defeats that accumulated into strategic catastrophe. The Tokyo Express runs, Japanese attempts to deliver supplies and reinforcements to Guadalcanal using fast destroyer convoys operating at night, continued partly because Japanese air forces could not protect slower transports during daylight hours. American fighters operating from Henderson Field, including Corsairs beginning in February 1943, made daylight. Naval operations suicidal for Japanese forces. This forced reliance on less efficient night operations, which in turn limited the volume of supplies that could be delivered. Garrisons withered and eventually collapsed for want of ammunition, food, and medical supplies that could not be delivered through American air dominance. The numerical attrition told a devastating story. In the 6 months following the Corsairs' introduction to the Solomon Islands, Japanese naval air losses accelerated dramatically. Units that had maintained operational strength through the bitter fighting of late 1942 found themselves unable to replace combat losses. Experienced pilots who had survived Pearl Harbor, the Philippines campaign, and the Indian Ocean raids were killed in aircraft that could no longer protect them. The training pipeline could not produce replacements fast enough, and even if it could, new pilots sent into combat against Corsairs in obsolete Zeros had virtually no chance of survival long enough to gain experience. Marine Fighting Squadron 124, the first Corsair unit, demonstrated the aircraft's potential in its initial months of combat. Between February and May 1943, VMF-124 pilots claimed 68 Japanese aircraft destroyed against only 11 Corsairs lost to all causes, including operational accidents. Several of those losses occurred during the learning period when pilots were still mastering the Corsair's handling characteristics. The aircraft had significant vices on carrier approaches, which led to its initial deployment to land-based marine squadrons rather than Navy carrier units. But in air-to-air combat, where speed and power determined outcomes, the Corsair proved devastatingly effective. First Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh of VMF-124 exemplified how the Corsair's performance translated into combat success. Walsh had flown Wildcats earlier in the war and understood the limitations of trying to dogfight Zeros. In the Corsair, he could impose his own tactical preferences on every engagement. He would patrol at altitude, maintain constant awareness of the tactical situation, and dive on Japanese formations only when conditions guaranteed success. If an attack run looked questionable, he would simply extend away, climb back to altitude, and wait for a better opportunity. This discipline, combined with the Corsair's performance, enabled Walsh to achieve 21 confirmed victories. He received the Medal of Honor for his combat effectiveness, but he credited the aircraft as much as his own skill. The Corsair gave him tactical options that simply did not exist in earlier American fighters. The speed differential manifested in specific, quantifiable ways that Japanese pilots found impossible to counter. In level flight at 15,000 feet, a Zero at maximum throttle could achieve approximately 330 miles per hour. A Corsair at military power, not even using full throttle, could maintain 380 miles per hour. This 50-mile-per-hour advantage meant that a Corsair could overtake a fleeing Zero, but a Zero could never overtake a fleeing Corsair. The tactical asymmetry was absolute. American pilots could choose to engage or disengage at will. Japanese pilots had no choice. They fought on American terms, or they died trying to escape attacks they could not evade. In diving attacks, the disparity became even more pronounced. A Corsair diving from 20,000 feet could exceed 450 miles per hour, approaching the edge of compressibility effects that limited piston-engine aircraft. A Zero attempting a similar dive would experience severe control, stiffening above 350 miles per hour, and its lighter structure risked catastrophic failure if speeds exceeded 400 miles per hour. Japanese pilots learned through bitter experience that diving away from a Corsair attack was fatal. The American fighter would simply follow, accelerating faster, closing range effortlessly, and firing when the Zero pilot was focused entirely on controlling his aircraft at speeds beyond its design limitations. Climb performance told the same story. At low altitude, the Corsair could climb at over 4,000 feet per minute. The Zero, lighter and with better power-to-weight ratio at low speeds, could match approximately 3,000 feet per minute initially. But as altitude increased, the Corsair's supercharged engine maintained power output, while the Zero's less sophisticated supercharger lost effectiveness. Above 15,000 feet, the Corsair enjoyed decisive advantages. Above 20,000 feet, the Zero became progressively less effective, while the Corsair maintained combat capability. American pilots learned to force combat at higher altitudes, where their performance advantages magnified. Japanese tactical responses evolved throughout 1943, but none proved effective against disciplined Corsair pilots. Some Zero units attempted to ambush American fighters by hiding in clouds and attacking when Corsairs passed nearby. This occasionally succeeded, but American pilots learned to avoid clouds that might conceal enemies and to maintain mutual support so that ambushed aircraft had wingmen to intervene. Other Japanese pilots tried to draw Corsairs into low-altitude dogfights near the ground, hoping that American pilots would make mistakes and crash while maneuvering. But Marine pilots maintained strict altitude discipline, refusing to follow Zeros below safe altitudes regardless of the temptation. Perhaps the most desperate Japanese tactic involved attempting to damage Corsairs during the initial high-speed attack pass. If a Zero pilot could recognize the attack early enough, he might turn hard into the diving Corsair, presenting a difficult deflection shot and forcing the American pilot to maneuver sharply to maintain tracking. Occasionally, this resulted in the Corsair pilot breaking off the attack to avoid collision, but more commonly, the American pilot simply continued his dive past the maneuvering Zero, accepted that this particular target had evaded, and looked for easier prey among other Japanese aircraft in the formation. One failed attack meant nothing when superior speed guaranteed unlimited additional opportunities. The Corsair's armament amplified its tactical advantages. 6 Browning M250 caliber machine guns, 3 in each wing, provided devastating firepower. Each gun could fire 800 rounds per minute, and the 6-gun battery could deliver a combined weight of fire exceeding 100 pounds per second. The 50 caliber round, substantially larger than the 7.7mm ammunition in the Zero's machine guns, could inflict catastrophic damage, even with glancing hits. Corsair pilots learned to hold fire until within 300 yards, where hit probability was high, then deliver a 2 or 3 second burst that frequently resulted in immediate destruction of the target. The Zero's armament, by contrast, consisted of 2 20mm cannon with 60 rounds per gun, and 2 7.7mm machine guns with 600 rounds per gun. The 20mm cannon was devastating when it hit, and the low rate of fire, approximately 500 rounds per minute, meant that the 60-round ammunition supply was exhausted in less than 7 seconds of continuous firing. Japanese pilots learned to fire only in short, precise bursts, but this precision gunnery required tracking the target for a full second or more to ensure hits. Against maneuvering Corsairs flashing past at over 400 miles per hour, opportunities for such tracking rarely existed. The contrast in ammunition capacity reflected deeper differences in tactical philosophy and industrial capability. American designers, working with an industrial base that could produce ammunition in virtually unlimited quantities, designed fighters to carry heavy ammunition loads. The Corsair carried 400 rounds per gun, 2,400 rounds total, This allowed extended combat operations and multiple attack runs without concerning about ammunition exhaustion. Japanese designers, constrained by more limited industrial capacity, minimized ammunition loads to save weight. The Zero's light armament load reflected the assumption that skilled pilots would make every shot count, but in the high-speed, fleeting engagements that characterized combat against Corsairs, even the most skilled Japanese pilots rarely had opportunities for careful aim. By mid-1943, Japanese naval air staff understood that the Zero was obsolete against the Corsair and other advanced American fighters entering service. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat, operational from January 1943, provided similar speed advantages, though with slightly different handling characteristics. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning, while primarily an Army aircraft, offered even more dramatic speed and firepower advantages with its twin-engine design. Republic P-47 Thunderbolts began appearing in the Pacific theater with devastating effect. Each new American fighter type shared common characteristics: powerful engines producing 1,800 to 2,000 horsepower, maximum speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour, heavy armament with abundant ammunition, and pilot protection that made them survivable even when damaged. Japanese attempts to develop competitive fighters faced systematic obstacles. The Kawanishi N1KJ Shiden Kai, perhaps the best Japanese fighter to reach production, achieved approximately 370 miles per hour, maximum speed, and possessed heavy armament, including 4 20mm cannon. American pilots who encountered Shiden Kai fighters in combat reported them as dangerous opponents, far more capable than Zeros. But the Shiden Kai entered service in late 1944, nearly 2 years after the Corsair. By then, improved versions of American fighters had progressed further. The Corsair itself received upgraded engines and modifications that increased maximum speed to 445 miles per hour in the F4U variant. More critically, Japan produced approximately 1,400 Shiden Kai fighters during the entire war. The United States produced over 12,600 Corsairs. This production disparity, more than any individual aircraft performance comparison, determined the air war's outcome. Even if the Shiden Kai had exactly matched the Corsair's capabilities, which it did not quite achieve, Japan could not produce them in sufficient numbers to contest American air superiority. Every Shiden Kai lost in combat or accident was a critical blow to already inadequate fighter strength. Every Corsair lost was replaced by 3 more coming off American production lines. The industrial capacity that enabled these production numbers also enabled rapid incorporation of combat lessons. When Marine pilots reported that the Corsair's cockpit visibility was inadequate for certain tactical situations, modifications were designed, tested, and incorporated into production within months. When pilots requested improved engine performance at high altitude, Pratt & Whitney developed enhanced superchargers and delivered upgraded engines to combat units. When armament specialists suggested improvements to gun harmonization, the changes appeared in subsequent production blocks. American industry treated aircraft as evolutionary products that could be continuously refined based on operational experience. Japanese industry, strained by resource shortages and lacking comparable production capacity, could not match this responsive development cycle. Design changes required extensive approval processes. Manufacturing modifications disrupted production lines that were already struggling to meet output targets. Quality control suffered as factories attempted to increase production rates. The result was that Japanese aircraft designs, even when superior on paper, often failed to achieve their intended performance in service due to manufacturing defects, material substitutions, and inadequate testing before deployment. The Zero remained in production throughout the war, not because it was the best fighter Japan could design, but because it was the fighter Japan could produce most efficiently. Manufacturing processes were established, suppliers were organized around Zero components, and production workers had developed expertise in Zero assembly. Switching to new designs required retooling factories, retraining workers, and disrupting production during a transition period. Given combat losses that exceeded production capacity even with the Zero, Japanese planners concluded they could not afford the temporary production gap that would result from switching to new designs. The Zero continued rolling off assembly lines, obsolete and inadequate, because there was no realistic alternative. This situation trapped Japanese pilots in an impossible position. They were ordered to contest American air operations using aircraft they knew were inferior. They faced opponents who could refuse combat on unfavorable terms and attack only when victory was assured. They watched their squadrons bleed, experienced pilots who could not be replaced with equally skilled aviators, and they understood, with increasing clarity throughout 1943 and 1944, that the speed gap was not a temporary problem that would be solved by new aircraft types. It was a fundamental expression of industrial inadequacy that would persist until Japan was defeated. First Lieutenant Jefferson de Blanc of Marine Fighting Squadron 112, flying Corsairs in the Solomon Islands, achieved 9 confirmed victories in a brief combat tour. His Medal of Honor citation noted his aggressive flying and tactical skill, but de Blanc himself emphasized the aircraft's role in his success. In a post-war interview, he stated that the Corsair allowed him to fight when conditions favored him and survive when they did not. He could attack from altitude, use speed to close on targets before Japanese pilots could react, deliver devastating fire, and extend away before return fire was effective. If he encountered a tactical situation that looked dangerous, superior speed meant he could simply leave. The Zero pilots he fought had no such options. They fought and died in aircraft that could no longer compete. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 demonstrated the cumulative effect of the speed differential and industrial disparity. Japanese naval aviation committed approximately 430 aircraft to the attack on American carrier task forces. American combat, air patrol included over 400 Hellcats and Corsairs. The ensuing engagement, remembered as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, resulted in catastrophic Japanese losses. American pilots claimed over 380 Japanese aircraft shot down during the two-day battle. American losses totaled approximately 30 aircraft in air combat. The lopsided kill ratio reflected multiple factors, including American numerical superiority, better radar direction, and increasingly inexperienced Japanese pilots. But the fundamental cause was aircraft performance disparity. Japanese pilots flying Zeros, Judys, and Jills encountered American fighters that could engage at will and disengage at will. Every attack occurred on American terms. Japanese pilots could not force favorable combat, could not escape unfavorable combat, and died in aircraft that had become obsolete 2 years earlier. The experienced aviators who had attacked Pearl Harbor and dominated the Pacific's early air battles were dead, replaced by barely trained novices who stood no chance against veteran American pilots in superior aircraft. By late 1944, the speed advantage that had first become apparent over Bougainville in February 1943 had expanded into total American air superiority. Japanese pilots who encountered American fighters understood their probable fate. Some fought with desperate courage, attempting to damage American aircraft before dying. Others became increasingly defensive, avoiding combat when possible and focusing on survival rather than mission accomplishment. A few, recognizing the hopelessness of conventional combat, volunteered for kamikaze units, where at least their deaths might achieve tactical effect. The Zero, designed as an agile dogfighter, ended its career as a guided missile, because that was the only role where its performance limitations did not guarantee immediate defeat. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe. The post-war analysis by American and Japanese military historians confirmed what combat pilots had learned through bitter experience. Speed determined modern air combat outcomes more decisively than maneuverability, firepower, or pilot skill. An aircraft that could control engagement range and timing possessed insurmountable tactical advantages. The Corsair's 85-mile-per-hour speed advantage over the Zero translated directly into American air superiority, because it allowed American pilots to impose their tactical preferences on every engagement. Japanese pilots, regardless of training or experience, could not overcome their aircraft's performance limitations through any amount of skill or courage. The Zero's design, brilliant for its intended mission parameters in 1937, had been optimized for qualities that proved less important than its designers anticipated. Range and maneuverability enabled the Zero to dominate early Pacific air combat when opponents were obsolete biplanes and early monoplane fighters. But when confronted by aircraft designed with different priorities, specifically speed and firepower enabled by overwhelming engine power, the Zero's advantages became irrelevant. A fighter that could turn inside any opponent but could never catch or escape from that opponent was worse than useless. It was a death trap that killed experienced pilots Japan could not afford to lose. The Corsair itself was not without limitations. Its long nose reduced forward visibility during carrier approaches. Its stiff landing gear and tendency to bounce on touchdown made carrier operations difficult until modifications were developed. Early production aircraft suffered from engine reliability problems and hydraulic failures, but these were teething troubles that American industrial capacity and engineering talent resolved systematically. By late 1943, the Corsair had matured into arguably the finest fighter aircraft of World War II, combining speed, firepower, range, and structural strength in a package that dominated every opponent it encountered. The F4U Corsair served until 1953 in American service, remaining effective through the Korean War against aircraft designed nearly a decade after its introduction. Its basic design proved so sound that continuous refinement kept it competitive across 15 years of aviation progress. The Zero, by contrast, was obsolete within 2 years of Pearl Harbor and remained in service only because Japan lacked alternatives. This contrast illustrated the difference between designs emerging from industrial depth and engineering sophistication versus designs emerging from resource constraints and limited development capacity. Flight Petty Officer Kaneyoshi Muto, whose encounter with Corsairs over Bougainville opened this account, survived the war. He flew Zeros throughout 1943 and into early 1944, somehow avoiding the fate that claimed most Japanese naval aviators. In post-war interviews, he described the progressive demoralization that accompanied repeated encounters with American fighters that could not be caught or escaped. He spoke of watching squadron mates die in aircraft everyone knew were obsolete. He described the frustration of perfect tactical positioning rendered meaningless by insufficient speed, and he acknowledged that by mid-1943, experienced Japanese pilots understood they were losing not because Americans fought better, but because Americans flew better machines produced by superior industry. The story of Japanese pilots engaging Corsairs at 400 miles per hour and realizing their Zeros topped out at 330 became more than a technical comparison of aircraft performance. It became a metaphor for the entire Pacific War, a conflict where industrial capacity determined outcomes more decisively than courage, skill, or tactical innovation. Japan had entered the war with excellent aircraft designs optimized for specific missions, but those designs reflected constraints and assumptions that proved fatally flawed against an opponent with greater industrial depth, more sophisticated technology, and willingness to invest overwhelming resources in achieving air superiority. The speed barrier that Muto encountered in February 1943 was not merely an engineering challenge, it was the physical manifestation of industrial inadequacy that no amount of pilot bravery could overcome. When Japanese pilots watched Corsairs accelerate beyond reach, they were witnessing their nation's defeat, written not in diplomatic cables or strategic assessments, but in the undeniable physics of thrust and drag, horsepower and velocity. The lesson, learned at terrible cost by aviators on both sides, was that modern warfare belonged not to with the bravest warriors, but to those with the most powerful engines and the industrial capacity to produce them in overwhelming numbers.